There exists a decade that not only changed the world but profoundly transformed the way people thought, felt, and related to the reality around them. The 1960s were not simply a period of time marked on the calendar of history. They were a watershed in the collective psychology of humanity, a moment when millions of individuals simultaneously awakened to question everything that previous generations had accepted as absolute and immutable truths. When we look at the black and white photographs from the beginning of that decade, we see faces that still carried the psychological marks of the wars that had devastated the world in previous decades. These were young people who grew up hearing stories of sacrifice, discipline, and conformity. Their parents had survived the Great Depression and the horrors of global conflicts, and transmitted to their children a worldview based on security, stability, and obedience to established structures. But something fundamental was about to rupture in this chain of psychological transmission between generations. The psychology of a generation is not formed in a vacuum. It is shaped by complex forces that interweave like invisible threads weaving the collective consciousness. And in the 1960s, three main forces converged to create an unprecedented psychological transformation. The first was music, which ceased to be mere entertainment to become an emotional language that expressed the deepest yearnings of an entire generation. The second was social movements, which offered not just political causes, but completely new psychological identities. And the third was conflicts, especially the one unfolding in distant lands of Southeast Asia, which forced millions of young people to confront existential questions about violence, morality, and the true meaning of patriotism. If you're enjoying this content, subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments the time you're watching this documentary. Your participation is very important to us. Let us begin with music, because it was through music that psychological transformation began to manifest itself in the most visceral and immediate way. At the beginning of the decade, young people still danced to melodies that, although lively, maintained an emotional structure that was relatively contained and socially acceptable. But then something changed. New sounds began to emerge, coming from small clubs in port cities, from places where young musicians experimented with distorted amplifiers and rhythms that broke all the rules of traditional harmony. The psychology behind this musical revolution was profound. For the first time in modern history, an entire generation had simultaneous access to a global youth culture through radio and records. This created something extraordinary from a psychological standpoint, a shared collective consciousness that transcended geographical and cultural boundaries. A teenager in San Francisco could feel the same emotions and have the same rebellious thoughts as a young person in London or Tokyo, all connected by the same soundtrack of transformation. But music did more than just connect geographically dispersed young people. It was operating a fundamental change in the very emotional structure of a generation. Lyrics stopped talking about innocent romances and began addressing themes that were previously considered taboo or inappropriate for youth entertainment. Questions about identity, alienation, social injustice, and the search for transcendental meaning began to dominate the songs that played incessantly on the portable radios that young people carried everywhere. From the standpoint of developmental psychology, this was revolutionary. The adolescents and young adults of the 1960s were not just passively consuming entertainment. They were using music as a tool to process complex emotional experiences and form their identities in direct opposition to the models their parents represented. Music became a mirror where this generation saw reflected not the person society expected them to be, but the person they felt they truly were inside. This psychological transformation through music had profound and lasting effects on the personality formation of millions of individuals. Later studies would show that people who went through adolescence and youth in the 1960s developed thought patterns significantly different from previous generations. They were more likely to question authorities, more open to new experiences, more willing to challenge social norms, and more engaged with issues of social justice. It was not just temporary adolescent rebellion. It was a fundamental psychological reconfiguration that many would carry throughout their lives. But music alone would not have had this transformative impact if it had not been amplified and directed by the social movements that swept the world during that extraordinary decade. And here we find the second great shaping force of that generation's psychology: The movements for civil rights, women's rights, against war, and for social justice were not merely political activities. They were, in their essence, movements of collective psychological transformation. Consider what it meant psychologically for a young Black American to participate in peaceful marches knowing they could be attacked, arrested, or even killed simply for claiming the basic rights of citizenship. This type of engagement required not just physical courage, but a complete reformulation of one's own psychological identity. It meant rejecting the identity of inferiority that centuries of oppression had tried to impose and embracing a new identity based on dignity, equality, and intrinsic human worth. This process of psychological transformation was deeply painful, but also incredibly liberating. For the young women of that decade, the psychological transformation was equally radical. They were being raised in a world that still expected that the apex of their achievements would be becoming dedicated wives and mothers, subordinate to men in practically all aspects of public and private life. But the feminist movements of the decade offered a completely different vision. For the first time on a large scale, young women began to imagine futures where they could be architects of their own lives, where their minds and talents would be valued as much as any man's, where their voices would have equal weight in the affairs of the world. This reimagining of themselves had profound psychological consequences. It generated anxiety and internal conflict, certainly, because these young women were simultaneously trying to meet the traditional expectations of their families while embracing radically different visions of who they could be. But it also generated tremendous psychological energy, a sense of possibility and agency that was completely new for most women throughout human history. The social movements of the decade also created what psychologists would call collective identity. It was not enough for an individual to change their own perception of themselves. The transformative power came from being part of something larger, from feeling connected to thousands or millions of other people who shared the same vision of a different and better world. This feeling of belonging to a movement greater than oneself provided psychological strength to face repression, ridicule, and even violence. But here we find one of the great psychological ironies of the decade. While these movements promoted ideals of peace, love, and unity, they also frequently generated deep divisions, even within families. Countless young people experienced painful ruptures with their parents, who saw the new values and behaviors of their children as betrayal of the sacrifices they had made. From a psychological standpoint, this created what theorists call loyalty conflict, where young people felt they had to choose between remaining faithful to their families or faithful to their own evolving consciences. And then there was the third shaping force, perhaps the most psychologically traumatic, the conflict unfolding thousands of miles away, but which penetrated deeply into the psyche of an entire generation. The war in Southeast Asia was not like previous conflicts that the parents of these young people had faced. There was no clear narrative of good versus evil, no universal feeling of moral purpose. Instead, it was a deeply ambiguous conflict that forced difficult questions about power, imperialism, and the human cost of government policies. For young men facing the possibility of being drafted, the psychological pressure was immense. They had to make decisions that would define their entire lives. Would they serve when called, even if they did not believe in the cause? Would they seek ways to avoid military service, risking being seen as cowards or traitors? Would they flee the country, becoming permanent exiles? Each of these choices carried profound psychological consequences that many would carry for decades. Even for those who did not directly face the draft, the war created a kind of collective trauma. The images that appeared on television every night showed the brutal reality of violence in a way that previous generations had never experienced. It was impossible to maintain romanticized illusions about war when you could see its horrors during dinner. This created what psychologists would call mass cognitive dissonance, a painful incompatibility between what authorities said about the war and what people could see with their own eyes. This dissonance had a profoundly corrosive effect on the trust the generation had in institutions and authorities. If the government could be so obviously wrong about something as important as war, what else was it wrong about? This widespread suspicion of authorities profoundly shaped the political psychology of an entire generation, creating a skepticism that persists today in many who lived through that era. But perhaps the most interesting psychological aspect of the decade was the collective search for alternative forms of consciousness and meaning. Facing a world that seemed insane with its wars, injustices, and contradictions, many young people turned inward, seeking transformations not just social, but personal and spiritual. They explored Eastern philosophies, meditative practices, and alternative communities, all in the search for states of consciousness that transcended the limitations of conventional thinking. From a psychological standpoint, this represented a massive rejection of the materialism and rationalism that had dominated Western culture for centuries. This generation was saying that there was more to human experience than what could be measured, calculated, and bought. They sought experiences of deep connection with other human beings and with something greater than themselves. This spiritual search, although sometimes naive, represented a genuine hunger for meaning in a world that seemed to have lost its moral center. The counterculture that emerged from this search created alternative psychological spaces where different values could be experimented with. In communes, festivals, and gatherings, young people tried to live according to principles of cooperation instead of competition, of emotional authenticity instead of social conformity, of personal freedom instead of obedience to norms. Not all of these experiments worked, certainly, but they represented sincere attempts to imagine and live different ways of being in the world. It is important to understand that this collective psychological transformation did not happen uniformly or without resistance. There were many young people who completely rejected the new values and clung firmly to their parents' traditions. There were those who oscillated uncomfortably between worlds, trying to find some kind of middle ground. And there were those who dove so deeply into the counterculture that they faced significant personal challenges. But even considering all this diversity of experiences, it is undeniable that something fundamental changed in human psychology during that decade. The boundaries of what was considered possible, acceptable, or normal were dramatically expanded. Questions that had been silenced for generations were brought to light and openly debated. Groups that had been marginalized found their voices and demanded to be heard. And individuals everywhere were forced to confront their own assumptions about who they were and how they wanted to live their lives. The long-term psychological effects of this decade continue to reverberate today. People who were shaped by those years frequently maintained throughout their lives an openness to change, a willingness to question authorities, and a sensitivity to issues of social justice that distinguishes them from other generations. They transmitted many of these values to their own children, creating waves of transformation that extend far beyond the decade itself. But they also carried psychological scars. Many experienced deep disillusionment when the utopian ideals of youth clashed with the stubborn realities of the world. They saw movements that promised peace and love fragment into bitter factions. They witnessed how some who spoke loudest about social transformation ended up reproducing the same power structures they criticized. And they had to deal with the fact that, despite all the energy and idealism invested in changing the world, many fundamental problems persisted or even worsened. However, it would be a mistake to see the decade only through the lens of later disillusionment. For those who lived it, there were moments of authentic psychological triumph. Moments when they felt they were genuinely making history and shaping a better future. There was the joy of finding community with others who shared their visions. There was the excitement of breaking barriers that had seemed insurmountable. There was the deep satisfaction of living according to their consciences, even when it required great personal sacrifice. The psychology of people shaped by the 1960s is, ultimately, a psychology of possibility. They learned, at a fundamental level, that social reality is not fixed or inevitable, but constructed by human beings and, therefore, can be reconstructed. They experienced the power of collective action to challenge structures that seemed permanent. They discovered that it was possible to question practically any aspect of social life, from the most basic gender roles to the most established government policies. This understanding had a liberating effect, but also created a certain type of psychological restlessness. Once you recognize that social structures are human constructions that can be changed, it becomes difficult to passively accept any structure that seems unjust or oppressive. This can lead to a life of active and meaningful engagement, but can also generate a chronic feeling of frustration when desired changes do not happen as quickly or completely as expected. Looking back now, decades later, we can see that the psychological transformation of the decade did not create the perfect world that many imagined. It did not eliminate war, racism, sexism, or economic injustice. But it fundamentally changed the conversation about all these issues. It established new standards of equality and justice that, even when not fully realized, continue serving as ideals to strive for. And it created models of activism and social transformation that continue inspiring new movements to this day. The music, movements, and conflicts of the 1960s did not just change policies or create new art forms. They changed the way millions of people thought about themselves, about their relationships with others, and about their responsibilities to the world. They created a generation that believed it was possible, and even necessary, to fight for a better world, even when the odds seemed overwhelming. This belief, with all its naivety and all its contradictions, represented something profoundly human and profoundly valuable. It represented the refusal to accept the status quo simply because it is the status quo. It represented the insistence that human beings deserve dignity, freedom, and opportunity, regardless of their race, gender, or origin. It represented the conviction that life must have meaning beyond mere survival and material accumulation. Perhaps the most important psychological legacy of that extraordinary decade is simply this: the demonstration that ordinary people, especially when united by shared visions and collective determination, have the power to challenge and transform even the most entrenched structures. This is not a lesson that can be easily forgotten by those who learned it through lived experience. And it is a lesson that continues to be transmitted, from generation to generation, as a precious gift and a solemn responsibility. As we reflect on the psychology of people shaped by those turbulent and transformative years, we are reminded that history is not just a succession of external events, but also a journey of internal transformation. Every great social movement begins with changes in individual and collective consciousness. Every cultural revolution has roots in the deep psychological experiences of real people facing real dilemmas and making choices that will define not just their own lives, but the course of history. And so, as we look back to that distant decade, we do not see just demonstrations in the streets, music festivals, and dramatic headlines. We see millions of intertwined individual psychological journeys, each unique, but all connected by the shared experience of living in a time of radical transformation. We see people struggling to understand who they were, what they believed in, and how they could live according to their consciences in a world that seemed to be simultaneously falling apart and rebuilding itself. May we honor this psychological heritage not with romanticized nostalgia, but with genuine appreciation for the courage it required and the vision it inspired. And may we carry with us the best lessons from that era, the unwavering belief that another world is possible and the willingness to work, even against great obstacles, to make that world a reality. For in the end, true transformation always begins within each of us, in our hearts and minds, guided by hope and sustained by faith that, with the help of the Lord God, we can become better versions of ourselves and create a more just, compassionate, and humane world for all.